The wind howled across the lonely valley, carrying the taste of dust and storm. Inside his small wooden cabin, the human sat by a weak fire. His name was Daniel, and he had lived on this alien world for 3 years. Far from Earth, far from the warmth of familiar faces, he had grown used to silence. Yet that night, silence was broken by something he never expected. 3 sharp knocks echoed against the door. Daniel froze. No one ever came this deep into the forest. Traders never bothered. Hunters avoided the wild creatures that prowled under the twin moons. For a long moment he thought the storm had tricked his ears. But then again, knock, knock. Knock, his chest tightened. Should he answer? His hand hovered over the latch. The sound carried desperation, not threat, like someone begging rather than demanding. Slowly, with caution learned from many hard nights, he opened the door. What he saw made his heart stumble. A woman stood in the rain, shivering violently. Her skin had a pale silver sheen, glowing faintly under the lightning. She was not human. Her features were sharp, alien yet strangely fragile. Her body was wrapped in nothing but a torn strip of cloth, clinging to her like it could barely hide her shame. Her bare feet were cut and bleeding. Daniel's throat went dry. She looked ready to collapse. Water dripped from her long hair, falling into her hollow eyes that seemed both terrified and pleading. For a second he could not move. She whispered something in a voice so soft he almost missed it. He could not understand her language, but the meaning was clear. "Help me." Daniel glanced past her into the dark forest. The storm roared and shadows danced between the trees. He sensed danger, though he could not see it yet. Whoever she was, she had not come here by accident. Someone or something had driven her to his door. His human instincts screamed caution. Harboring an alien without knowing her story could mean death. But another voice, the voice he carried from Earth, urged him to act. No one deserved to freeze outside in such misery. He stepped back and gestured inside. The alien woman hesitated, her eyes wide as if she expected a trap. Then with trembling steps she crossed his threshold. Her knees buckled, and Daniel quickly caught her before she hit the floor. Her skin was icy cold, her breath shallow and weak. He guided her toward the fire, wrapping his only spare blanket around her thin frame. For a long while she just sat there, staring at the flames like she had never seen warmth before. Her hands shook as if every muscle had forgotten safety. Daniel tried speaking slowly, carefully, using words she might recognize. But she only lowered her head, silent tears rolling down her strange cheeks. Outside, the storm grew worse. Thunder cracked, shaking the cabin walls. Between the rolls of thunder, Daniel thought he heard something else. Heavy steps. Movement in the darkness. It was faint, far off, but his instincts sharpened. She was not alone. The woman suddenly clutched his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong despite her weakness. Her lips moved again, whispering words in her alien tongue. Though he did not understand, her eyes told him everything. She was hunted. Daniel's pulse quickened. He looked at the door, then back at her. He realized the moment he had opened that door, his life had changed. Whatever had driven her here, it was now at his doorstep too. The fire crackled, throwing dancing shadows across the room. The woman pulled the blanket tighter around her and curled against the wall, as if making herself small would make her invisible. Daniel sat across from her, his hand resting near the old hunting knife he kept. Neither of them spoke. The storm raged. The knocks had stopped, but their echo still hung in his mind. Each second stretched longer than the last, and then, faint but clear from the woods outside, another sound. Not the storm, not the wind. A voice deep and commanding, calling in the night. The alien woman stiffened and buried her face in the blanket. Daniel's heart pounded. The danger was real. The night was no longer his own. The storm outside raged louder, while inside the cabin the fire struggled to stay alive. And the alien woman sat trembling, under the heavy blanket Daniel had given her. Her silver skin gleamed faintly in the flicker of the flames, and her eyes darted around the room like those of a cornered animal that had never known safety. Daniel watched her carefully, wondering if she would speak, or if fear had stolen her voice forever. His heart still pounded from the sound he had heard in the forest, and he could not shake the feeling that hunters were out there searching for her even now. The walls of the cabin felt too thin to keep out the danger that circled in the dark. He poured warm water into a small cup and held it out toward her. She flinched as if expecting him to strike her, then slowly reached out with shaking fingers and took the cup. She drank greedily, spilling half the water down her chin. Daniel felt a sharp pang in his chest. Whoever she was, she had been treated so badly that even a simple act of kindness seemed like a trap. He tried to smile to ease her fear, but she only stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes. She pressed her body tighter into the wall, keeping distance as though she could not believe he meant her. No harm. Minutes stretched into long, heavy silence. The fire cracked, but even that sound seemed loud. Daniel broke the silence by speaking slowly in human words. He said his name and pointed to his chest, hoping she might understand. Then he gestured at her as if asking for her name. She opened her mouth but stopped and lowered her head. Her lips trembled, yet no sound came. She pulled the blanket tighter until only her eyes showed. Daniel realized she was terrified not only of the world outside but of him as well. Trust would not come easily. He would have to earn it. Outside, the storm began to fade, but the noises of movement grew clearer. Daniel's instincts told him they were closer now, maybe circling the cabin. He stood quietly and checked the windows. The woman's gaze followed every move he made. When he returned to the fire, she finally whispered a single word, her voice weak but sharp with meaning. It was not English, but the tone carried desperation. Daniel guessed she was begging him not to open the door again. He nodded to reassure her and saw her shoulders loosen just a little. A fragile thread of trust had formed. He offered her food. A small piece of bread from his supplies. At first she refused, shaking her head quickly. But when her stomach growled loud in the silence, her face flushed and she accepted. She ate in small, careful bites like someone afraid it would be taken away. Daniel pretended not to notice her tears as she chewed. It was clear she had not eaten properly for days, maybe longer. Something about the way she held the bread with both hands made him realize how precious it was to her. More than just food, it was proof that she was not worthless to everyone. For a brief moment, her eyes softened. She looked at Daniel with a question unspoken. Why was he helping her when others would have turned her away? He had no answer. He only knew he could not watch her suffer. He placed more wood on the fire and kept his knife within reach. He would guard her as long as she stayed under his roof. The night stretched onward, heavy with tension. Every creak of the wood and every whisper of wind carried the weight of approaching danger. Yet inside the cabin, a fragile bond began to grow. She no longer sat curled as tight. She leaned closer to the warmth and dared to rest her head against the wall with her eyes half closed. Daniel understood she was still afraid, but exhaustion was winning. He promised himself silently that no harm would come to her as long as he lived. Outside, unseen eyes searched for their prey, but inside, for the first time, she had found a place where hope might be possible. The cabin grew colder as the night deepened, and though the fire still burned the unease in, Daniel's chest was far stronger than the chill, for he knew the noises outside were not tricks of the storm, but the steady tread of something searching and circling. The alien woman sensed it too, for she clutched the blanket tightly and her sharp silver eyes flicked again and again toward the door as though she expected it to burst open at any moment. Daniel kept his knife near, but he also knew a blade was nothing if a group of hunters waited in the forest. Still, he had no choice but to stand between her and whatever threat lurked beyond the walls. The wind carried faint voices now, low and guttural, spoken in a language Daniel could not understand. Each word rolled like a growl through the trees. The alien woman covered her mouth with one trembling hand as if afraid that even her breath would give them away. Daniel crouched near the window and dared to lift the corner of the curtain. Through the rain, he caught glimpses of shadows tall and broad. Their figures moved slowly but with purpose. Hunters indeed, and they carried weapons that gleamed faintly in the stormlight. His throat tightened. They were too close, and it was clear they were searching. He let the curtain fall and turned to the woman. She stared at him with silent desperation. He raised one finger to his lips, asking for silence. She nodded quickly, her shoulders shaking. Daniel's mind raced. Should he hide her under the floorboards or in the small storage shed outside? No, too risky. The hunters would check every corner. Better to keep her inside where he could defend her. Yet he wondered, defend with what? One knife and a stubborn will. The odds seemed impossible, but he refused to abandon her. Not after seeing her broken state. Not after hearing her soft cries of hunger. Time dragged heavy. Every knock of rain on the roof sounded like footsteps. Every groan of timber echoed. Like a warning, then came a sharper sound. A crack of a branch just outside the wall. Daniel's heart hammered. The hunters were closing in. He motioned for the woman to stay low and crawled silently to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. He heard breathing, deep and steady, only feet away. They were here, listening, perhaps sniffing for their prey. The silence between them felt like a blade pressed against his neck. The alien woman began to shiver violently, not from cold but from terror. Her eyes glistened with tears she fought to hide. Daniel crawled back to her and placed a firm hand on her shoulder, steadying her. her gaze locked on his. In that moment, without words, they shared the same fear and the same decision. She would not go back to them, and he would not give her up. The bond grew stronger in the silence, forged not by trust alone, but by the shadow of death surrounding them. Then a voice outside barked an order. Heavy boots struck the ground, and the hunters moved away from the door. Daniel exhaled quietly, though his muscles stayed tense. They were not gone, only circling, testing, searching for weakness. He knew they would return, perhaps when the fire burned low, perhaps when exhaustion dulled his watch, but they would not give up so easily. And so he tightened his grip on the knife and stayed awake. Guarding through the endless night hours passed slowly. The woman eventually curled near the hearth, her breathing unsteady but calmer than before. Daniel could not rest. His eyes never left the door. He thought of Earth, of a life once simple, and wondered how fate had brought him to this stormy world to shelter a stranger hunted by shadows. Yet deep inside he felt something awaken, a fire not from wood or flame but from resolve. If the hunters came again, they would not find him cowering. They would find a human willing to stand and fight. The night whispered threats, but Daniel whispered back a promise, that she was no longer alone. The storm finally faded into a low rumble across the valley, yet the silence it left behind felt even heavier for Daniel, and the alien woman knew that the hunters were still, close though hidden by the trees and darkness. The fire in the cabin gave off a dim glow, and the smell of smoke clung to the walls while the woman sat wrapped in the blanket with her silver skin shimmering faintly under the faint light. Daniel had not slept at all, for his eyes remained sharp and his ears strained at every whisper outside. Yet when the dawn began to touch the sky with pale colors, something changed. The woman at last raised her face, and her trembling lips began to form words. Her voice was hoarse and quiet, but Daniel leaned forward, listening with every part of his being. Though he could not understand the language fully, he caught fragments and gestures that told the story. She pressed her palm against her chest as if naming herself, then mimed chains around her wrists and her neck. Daniel's jaw clenched, for the meaning was clear. She had been enslaved or held captive. She pulled back the blanket to reveal faint scars running along her arms. Thin white marks burned into her flesh, marks that spoke of cruelty and ownership. Daniel felt anger rise within him, stronger than fear. Whoever had hunted her had treated her as nothing more than property, and that truth burned in her eyes like a wound that never healed. She spoke more rapidly now, mixing fragments of her tongue with desperate gestures. Daniel tried to follow. She pointed toward the forest, then drew a shape in the air with her finger that resembled a crest or a banner. She shook her head violently, and tears welled in her eyes. She whispered again and again a word that sounded sharp and bitter, perhaps the name of the master or tribe that had claimed her. Daniel understood enough. She had run from someone powerful, someone who would never stop searching. The hunters outside were not strangers. They were her captors, and they had come to reclaim what they thought belonged to them. For a long moment Daniel said nothing. The weight of her confession filled the cabin thicker than the smoke. Finally, he placed a hand on his chest and spoke his name again, slowly, clearly. She repeated it in a broken accent. Then she pointed at herself and whispered a name, soft and fragile. It was the first gift of trust she had given him, a piece of her identity she had hidden until now. He nodded with respect and repeated it back to her as best as he could. Her eyes widened at his effort, and for the first time a hint of warmth softened her face. The bond between them deepened like roots breaking through stone. Daniel felt the danger pressing closer with every passing second, yet he also felt a new responsibility stronger than fear. He could not hand her back. Not after hearing the truth of her suffering. She looked at him with hope trembling in her gaze, as if asking whether he would protect her even if it meant facing death. Daniel gave a slow, firm nod and gripped his knife tighter. Words were not needed. The promise was clear. Outside the forest grew quiet, too quiet. Birds had fallen silent, and even the wind held its breath. Daniel sensed that the hunters were preparing something, perhaps waiting for night to fall again. The woman moved closer to him without thinking, resting lightly against his arm, her body still weak but her spirit slowly finding strength in the shadow of his resolve. Daniel stared into the flames and realized that his life had already changed. No longer was he simply a man surviving alone on an alien world. Now he carried another life within his protection, a hunted stranger who had chosen to knock on his door, and in doing so had bound his fate to hers. The morning light crept across the floor, yet, instead of comfort, it carried a new tension for the day ahead. Would not bring peace but confrontation. Secrets had been revealed and choices made. Daniel knew the hunters would return soon, and when they would discover that the human they thought weak was ready to fight for the woman who had found shelter in his cabin. The sun had climbed high, though its light brought no comfort, for Daniel felt the weight of eyes upon the cabin, and the alien woman sensed it too as she gripped the blanket with both hands and refused to move far from his side. The forest was quiet in a way that spoke not of peace but of predators waiting, and Daniel's breath grew tight with every passing minute. He knew the hunters had not left. They were watching, testing, waiting for the right moment to strike. His knife rested within reach, yet even he knew a single blade was little against trained pursuers armed with cruel weapons. Then it came, a heavy pounding at the door so sudden the walls shook and the woman cried out, muffled by fear. Daniel stood firm, though his heart thundered. The voice that followed was harsh and commanding. Foreign words filled the air, yet the tone was unmistakable. They demanded the woman be surrendered. Daniel glanced at her and saw her silver eyes wide with terror and pleading. She shook her head violently, pressing herself against the wall as if she could vanish into it. Her lips whispered broken sounds that needed no translation. She begged him not to open. The pounding grew louder, fists striking wood like drums of war. Daniel steadied his breath and called out in his own tongue. He told them to leave, though he knew they did not understand. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Then another voice rang out, colder and sharper. It carried a threat that pierced through the barrier of language. If he refused, they would burn the cabin to ash. Daniel's jaw clenched. He had built this shelter with his own hands, and it had been his refuge for years. Now it was a target, yet none of that mattered compared to the life cowering behind him. He stepped closer to the woman and placed his hand over hers. Her trembling slowed just enough for her to meet his gaze. In that brief moment he gave her his answer without words. He would not give her up no matter the cost. Her eyes filled with tears that glimmered like liquid silver in the dim light. She clutched his hand in return, and Daniel felt the bond harden like forged steel. He turned back to the door with a new fire in his chest. Outside footsteps shifted. Shadows passed before the small window. They were surrounding the cabin. Daniel moved quickly to block the shutters with spare planks. The woman hurried to help, though her hands shook. Together they barred the weak openings as best they could. Every thud of wood and scrape of nail echoed like a heartbeat racing against time. When at last they finished, the cabin felt darker but stronger, a small fortress against the storm of enemies closing in. The hunters called out again, their words filled with anger. They demanded one final time. Daniel's silence was his answer. He heard their growls of frustration, then the scrape of metal as weapons were drawn. The air outside filled with movement. Branches snapped under heavy steps. He braced himself by the door, knife tight in his grip. Muscles taut with readiness, the woman stood behind him, clutching a broken piece of wood as if ready to fight at his side despite her weakness. Daniel felt a surge of pride and determination. She was no longer only a victim. She was someone willing to stand even if it meant falling together. Minutes dragged like hours until suddenly everything stilled. The forest held its breath. Daniel knew the strike was coming. He whispered to the woman to stay low, though she did not understand the words. She understood the tone. Her head lowered, but her eyes remained fixed on him, filled with both fear and faith. Outside, the hunters prepared their move. Inside, Daniel prepared his heart. The test had come. The cabin door rattled under the first blow, and the battle for her freedom began. The door shuddered under the force of the blows, and each strike sent dust raining from the beams above. Yet Daniel held his ground with knife clenched tight in his fist and eyes burning with resolve, while behind him the alien woman crouched low, still gripping the broken plank as though it were a weapon forged for her alone. The hunters outside barked to one another in guttural tones, and their shadows shifted across the thin cracks of the shutters. Daniel's breath came slow and steady, for he knew if fear ruled him now, then both their lives would be lost. Another crash shook the cabin, and the wooden frame groaned, yet held for a moment longer. Daniel raised his voice and shouted words they might not understand yet. The tone carried a message of iron. He would not surrender. Silence followed, only for the world to erupt with snarls and curses. The hunter struck again, harder this time, and a section of the door split at the edge. The woman gasped and pressed her back against the wall as if the sound alone had sliced into her. Daniel moved in front of the crack, his shoulders squared like a shield. His body no longer his own, but hers to guard. Then came a pause, a heavy, dreadful stillness. Daniel sensed the hunters reconsidering their approach. Perhaps they expected fear to drive him into handing her over. Instead, they found a human who refused to bend. He imagined their faces twisted in disbelief, for in their eyes humans were weak and fragile, yet here he stood defiant as stone. They must have realized that breaking the cabin would not be enough. They would have to break his spirit. But Daniel's spirit was not theirs to take. The pounding resumed, yet this time he was ready. He guided the woman toward the far side where he had set crude traps with wire and nails meant for animals, but now pressed into greater service. She followed though her hands shook. Trust now guided her steps more than fear. Daniel returned to the door and with sudden force threw it open before the next strike could land. Rain and cold rushed in, but so too did the sight of 3 towering hunters, their armor dark and their weapons sharp with cruel designs. They froze in shock, for they had expected a cowering figure, not a man bursting forth with knife raised and fury blazing. Daniel lunged with the precision of a survivor who had fought beasts of the forest. His blade caught the nearest hunter across the arm. The alien roared in pain and stumbled back while the others advanced. Daniel kicked the broken doorframe into their legs, buying a heartbeat of space. The woman cried out but did not flee. Instead, she hurled the wooden plank through the gap, striking one of the hunters across the face. The surprise gave Daniel another chance, and he pressed forward, striking again and again, not with strength alone, but with cunning, aiming at joints and weak points in their armor. The fight raged fierce yet uneven. Daniel knew he could not win by sheer force, but each cut, each trap, each desperate move slowed them. He led one hunter into the wire snare, and with a swift pull brought the alien crashing down. The woman rushed to strike with a stone, and together they forced the attacker back into the mud. The remaining 2 growled in fury, but hesitation flickered in their eyes. This was not what they had expected. The human was not prey, but a defender, stubborn and dangerous, breath ragged. Arms aching, Daniel stood tall before them, knife still ready. He shouted again, his voice a storm itself. He would not yield. The hunters growled in their tongue, yet began to retreat, dragging their wounded companion, their pride torn as deep as their flesh. The rain swallowed their curses as they faded into the forest shadows. Daniel did not relax until silence returned, though his body trembled with exhaustion. Inside the cabin, the woman dropped the plank and rushed to his side, her eyes shining with both terror and awe. She touched his arm as if to confirm he was real. Daniel looked at her and saw no longer a helpless stranger, but a partner who had chosen to fight beside him. The bond between them now sealed by blood and fire. Outside the forest hid enemies who would surely return, but inside a new truth had been forged. A human could stand against the impossible and refuse to break. The forest settled into uneasy silence after the hunters withdrew. Yet Daniel knew their retreat was not defeat but delay, for they would return with greater strength and greater fury. The cabin smelled of smoke and blood, while broken wood lay scattered at the threshold, and the alien woman stood close to him, still trembling, though her eyes now carried a strange light, no longer only fear, but a fragile spark of hope, born from what she had just witnessed. Daniel himself felt his body ache with every cut and bruise, but he refused to show weakness. His stance remained tall because he understood that in her eyes he had become more than a man. He had become the line between life and death. The day crawled forward heavy with tension. Daniel worked to repair the door with quick hands, and the woman helped though her fingers shook. Together they lifted planks and tied them with rope until the cabin stood firm once more, though scarred. Every strike of hammer echoed through the valley like a warning to the hunters that the human was not broken. When the work was done, Daniel collapsed by the fire, and the woman sat across from him, staring with unblinking eyes. At last she spoke his name in her broken voice and whispered a string of words he could not fully understand. Yet her hand pressed to her chest told him the meaning. She was grateful. She had been given back something she thought forever lost. Dignity and choice. As night crept once more, Daniel sharpened his blade while the woman prepared food with what little supplies remained. She moved with care and quiet skill, as if trying to repay him for what he had risked. He watched her silently, struck by the shift in her manner. She no longer curled in fear, but stood taller, though still cautious. He realized that courage was not only his to carry. She was finding her own courage within the fragile safety he had built. Outside, the forest whispered and shadows lengthened. The hunters had not forgotten, but neither had she. The bond between them grew stronger with each heartbeat. Then the sound returned. Low growls from the distance, torches flickering beyond the trees. Daniel rose, and the woman joined him at the door. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. Both knew this would be the true test. The hunters had come again, more of them now, their shapes looming large in the night, weapons gleaming under firelight. Daniel gripped his knife, but also felt something deeper burn within. A will stronger than steel. The will to protect not only her, but the bond they had forged. She placed her hand lightly over his, as if lending him her strength. Together they faced the storm. The hunters advanced with cruel laughter, expecting surrender, but what they saw instead was defiance carved into the face of a human who refused to bow. Daniel shouted into the night, his voice cutting through the trees like thunder. The woman stood beside him, raising her broken plank as if it were a blade forged for battle. The sight startled the hunters who had never imagined she would resist. Their hesitation gave Daniel the moment he needed. He had set traps through the day, hidden among the brush and mud, and as the hunters charged, the snares pulled tight. Spikes snapped upward, chaos erupted under their feet. Daniel lunged forward, striking fast and fierce while the woman fought at his side, her cries filled with fire. The battle raged under the twin moons. Every strike, every scream echoing through the valley. Yet Daniel never faltered. Each blow came with the strength of a promise he had made the moment he opened the door to her. And when the hunters realized their losses, they fell back, dragging their wounded, their pride shattered, their power broken. The night swallowed them as they fled into the trees, leaving behind silence once more. This time not of dread, but of triumph. Inside the cabin, Daniel dropped to his knees, breathless yet unbroken. The woman knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face, though her lips curved in something close to a smile. She touched his chest and whispered words heavy with meaning. Though he could not understand them fully, he knew enough. She no longer saw him as weak or fragile. She saw him as protector, as ally, as more than she had ever believed a human could be. Together they had turned fear into strength and despair into defiance. The night of truth had ended, and in its ashes a bond unshakable had been born.